afternoon, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to today's webinar, How to Find Your Voice and Be Heard at Work. Today's webinar is presented by Smith Business Insight and by Queen's Executive Education. And my name is Meredith Dalt. I'm a business journalist here at Smith School of Business at Queen's University in Kingston. And before I introduce today's guests, I want to remind you, as I always do, that today's discussion will be recorded. You will be getting a link to that recording by email in a couple of days. People often ask about getting the slides. What I will say is we don't send the slides out, but that you will be able to access them via the recording, which you'll be getting. If you want to ask a question, and I hope that you will, I will invite you to use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So not the chat, please use the Q&A button and we will get to questions as in the order they come in, best we can. I would encourage you to get your questions in early and often because we don't always get to all of them, but we always try. And if you get your question in early, we'll get to it sooner. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's guest speakers, Dr. Kyle Brickman and Dr. Jana Raver. Kyle Brickman is an assistant professor of management at the Odette School of Business at the University of Windsor. His research focuses on employee voice and interpersonal team dynamics, including team resilience and conflict. Dr. Brickman's research has been published in prestigious academic journals, including the Journal of Organizational Behavior, Small Group Research, and Group and Organization Management. He completed his PhD at Smith School of Business. Thanks for being with us, Dr. Brickman. And Jana Raver is an associate professor and the E. Marie Shantz Professor of Organizational Behavior at Smith School of Business. She is an authority on interpersonal relations and team dynamics at work, with a specific emphasis on the ways in which employees build and sustain high-performance teams. Dr. Raver is an expert on workplace diversity and cultural differences, and her award-winning research has been published in numerous prestigious journals and has received federal grants. Jana, thank you for being with us as well. I'm going to turn myself off and come back for questions. So see you then.
All right, thank you so much, Meredith, and thank you to everyone out there, all of the attendees who are taking time out of your busy days in order to be here and listen to us talk about voice. Now, before we dive in, I just want to be clear that this is not a voice lesson. I'm not going to be singing today, so it's not that kind of voice that we're going to be talking about in our session today. And you do not want to hear me sing. But what we will be talking about, I want to start with a scenario actually, as a way of getting you thinking about the nature of voice and when we use it. So first, I want everyone to think about the last time that you were frustrated at work. It might have been yesterday, it might have been this morning, but sometime when you're like, oh, I really wish I could have spoken up, or I really wish it was something that was just incredibly frustrating and annoying. It might have been unsafe. It might have been unethical. Something where you, in one example might be in a customer service organization, the quality of service has been declining over time. And you're seeing some newer customer service agents that are actually, starting to derogate the customers and making shortcuts. Another example might be in a construction company where you've seen managers actually encourage people to make some shortcuts to increase the productivity or speed of work, so they're not wearing the personal protective equipment. Now, these are just two examples, but we can take any of your own experiences of being frustrated in an organization and map out what are the possibilities that you have in order to respond. So there's an economist named Albert Hirschman who actually developed a model to explain essentially the set of options that you have when you're frustrated. Now, he actually talked about societies as well, so this could be applied to political scenarios. But let's see, what can you do? So you could basically do what you're currently doing now, which is sit back and do nothing. You're going to try to be loyal to the organization and kind of just sit back and hope that something is going to happen. Something productive is going to happen as a function of, somebody else will take action, somebody else will notice what's actually going on, but you're going to maintain your loyalty. Okay? On the flip side, you might say, well, no one else around here seems to care anymore. So maybe you yourself are going to start to decline the quality of the service you provide, or you're going to also start skipping the PPE, the safety equipment. Maybe you're going to start slacking. Maybe you're not going to show up to work. You're going to just start to not care as much. And this is called neglect. That's another possibility. It's a little bit more on the destructive side because now you're actually starting to harm the organization or do these deviant behaviors as well. You might decide, I've had enough. This is it. I'm not putting up with this anymore, and that you're going to go find a better organization. This is exit. Now, all three of these options are viable. And we have a lot of research that looks at all of these different types of things that people can do in order to solve their organizational problems. But the one that is surprisingly neglected, and we don't know as much about until recently, is employee voice, which is how do we actually take a constructive approach to changing the situation? And that's where we're focusing today, is that employee voice. So we're going to dive into its definition really quickly here. I'll spend most of the session turning it over to Kyle, and he's going to speak about some of our research about why employees withhold voice, and what we specifically found about how to voice more effectively through high quality voice. He'll also speak about how leaders can encourage voice. And towards the end of the session, I'll come back on and talk about those more macro organization-wide cultural practices and some other kind of digital practices that are new that can help organizations to encourage voice overall. Okay, so formal definition here. So what is employee voice? They're communications that are intended to improve work conditions or outputs. So you're trying to solve a problem in the organizations. Now, it can be ideas or suggestions, it can be issues and concerns, it can be complaints, it might be information sharing, but any way of actually trying to elicit that constructive change. And it can be challenging in nature, I should say that. And it can be individual in the sense that you're doing it alone. But when employees get together through some grassroots organizing or even union organizing and decide that they want to make change together, that's also a form of voice. Now, why is it important? I mean, as you can imagine, employees have the most crucial knowledge about the business because they're on the front lines every single day, knowing what can actually improve decisions, how the company can save money, how they can be more efficient, how they can be more safe. Employees have this information. So not surprisingly, a substantial amount of research now has shown that employee voice is beneficial for team performance, for example, team decision-making, for innovation and creativity, team learning. We know also that, for example, in healthcare contexts, if you're working for in a healthcare unit where the surgeon or the doctors or the medical professionals in charge actually encourage an openness to different ideas versus suppressing them, that people are actually way more likely to report errors. They're more open to saying, oh, wait a second, let's actually prevent this medication error or even surgical errors. So it's if people in the organizational environment feel safe to express their ideas, then you actually are able to detect errors far more effectively. And not surprisingly, people feel respected more, so they're less likely to leave or exit. So that improves retention and turnover rates in the organization. Financially, one study showed us that just a conservative estimate shows that a mid-size organization is going to lose approximately $100,000 a year just from the turnover costs associated with employees feeling ignored. So with this foundation in place, I'm going to turn it over to Kyle, and he's going to dive into the question of essentially why employees are having challenges with voicing and what we can do about it. Kyle, over to you.
So why speak up? Well, for me at least, it's because I noticed something that didn't make sense, that I thought was hurting my company, and it's something that we could actually fix. Now, this happened early in my career at General Mills when I noticed that we didn't have a really effective way at tracking products for one of our major retailers. And unfortunately, the company wasn't very resistant. I mean, at first I kind of had that corporate speak of, this is the way things are done here. But I had a really open manager who connected me with somebody internally, and together we developed a system for that retailer that was used for many years. And I offer this illustration because I think a lot of us know that it's the employees who are on the front lines that are actually innovating, that notice issues, that have really valuable ideas. And unless we encourage them and give them an ability to actually speak up, we're never going to have those ideas rise to upper management and actually improve organizations. But also then those employees are not going to feel empowered that they can actually make a difference. And so a very important thing that we're trying to shoot for here. Throughout the presentation, I've got a few of these quotes interspersed. This is coming from some of the people that we had interviewed for the research that I'm presenting. And this came from a CEO of a company who described to us that especially when you're a leader, that it can be a very lonely role, that you're constantly under pressure. Your team thinks that they have all the answers, but you really don't. So the better your team is at giving these helpful suggestions and being thoughtful, it makes your job much easier and makes the company much more successful. Again, that these ideas are so critical for organizations to be able to adapt to unexpected changes, to innovate and improve and notice issues like Jan had mentioned. Unfortunately, though, we know that most of the time employees don't feel comfortable speaking up. In fact, 1 in every 2 employees generally feels reluctant to speak up with these ideas. And almost every employee has at least one point felt reluctant to speak up. And I mean, this is pretty alarming. What we're talking about here isn't whistleblowing or referencing some sort of major grievance or a major issue. These are speaking up with ideas that can be beneficial for the employees and the organizations. But again, we know that people are generally hesitant to do so. Why do employees withhold voice? Well, the research kind of points to both individual, relational, and organizational reasons. So at the individual side, we know that some people, maybe with a lack of experience, it could be a personality factor, how happy you are at your work. Some research that we've just included shows us that on weeks when people are feeling a little bit more depressed or anxious, they're also less likely to speak up. So a lot of individual reasons that could be pushing that. Relational reasons is probably where a lot of the research has actually been focusing on. We know that people are more likely to speak up if they see their leader as open and encouraging, if they have a really good relationship with their leader, if they don't think that their leader has got a strong ego, so they won't be so defensive when they speak up, more likely to voice. And also a lot of organizational reasons when it comes to a supportive culture or climate. The hierarchies, is there a lot of red tape, and the bureaucracies within the organization can also have an impact. And this is really helpful because this is the framework Jana kind of already alluded to that we're going to be pushing for with this session. I'm now going to talk about some individual reasons and focusing on the voice quality, which empowers employees to speak up more specifically with effective ideas. And then I'm going to transition a little bit to what leaders can do to encourage people to speak up, at which point Jan is going to come back on and focus on the organizational systems that can promote voice. So in terms of why, and to help us understand what we can do as individuals to speak up more, it's really important to understand why are we withholding voice. And what you can see here is actually a very common theme around fears. There's a lot of risks associated with voice, and we know people are generally hesitant to speak up because they view it as potentially dangerous. They might be labeled negatively as the troublemaker, right, as that complainer. They don't want to damage a relationship. They don't want to be seen as that person who's always ruffling feathers and maybe creating more work for other people. They think it might lead to some sort of retaliation, social retaliation, or maybe even a career form of retaliation. Maybe they'll get passed over for promotion. But equally important is that middle bar that I think we often overlook. And this is something I'm going to come back to when I speak to how leaders can encourage voice. It's this feeling of futility that also prevents people from speaking up. That is that they think it's just going to fall on deaf ears. It's not going to make a difference. So why would I bother incurring these risks if I know it's not actually going to have an impact anyways? And together, this is why people generally don't speak up at work. Some newer research has actually suggested that these feelings that voice is risky are actually implicit. That is to say, they're hardwired, that basically everybody feels them to some extent, regardless of the situation you're in, regardless of the company you're in, regardless of who you're working for, that we all kind of have these almost hardwired from how we were raised potentially. What we found was really interesting about this is you can notice there's some similarities to the other research about the fears, about the issues of maybe creating a problem with your manager. What came up here was the idea of needing solid data or solutions that we hadn't seen before. And this was really a critical point for us because we wondered, well, maybe then if we're able to offer higher quality ideas, if we can help employees offer higher quality ideas, it will make voice less risky, probably also more likely to result in better outcomes for them and for their organization. The problem was we didn't really know what is a high quality voice, right? What is it that constitutes high quality voice? And that was the point of departure for the research that we conducted. Now, as any academics, to start understanding what exactly is a high quality voice, we started with reading academic literatures on persuasion, on whistleblowing, general communications, feedback seeking, all kinds of research. We supplemented that with about 70 interviews and or open-ended surveys with employees, leaders, managers, CEOs of companies to triangulate what exactly is this quality. What was really interesting is that we found that everyone had their own barometer of what quality was. It was kind of in the eye of the beholder, so to speak. And so without having that one precise idea, what we realized was that quality isn't just one thing, it's comprised of a few different facets. And overall, we found these four critical facets of what makes voice very high quality. The first one is a rationale. That's the extent to which, when you speak up, that you're offering something that is really well-reasoned. It's pragmatic. You've got some evidence to support what you're saying. I think of rationale as the why behind when you're speaking up. So if you've got a message to communicate, it's so important. And this is something we do see probably as the most prevalent, but still gets overlooked, is offering a really, really clear why, supporting it with evidence, right? Showing that you've actually thought through what you're supposed to do and why you think this new idea is really important is critical in order to get that initial buy-in. So rationale, probably the one that we see the most of. The other three facets, a little bit less so. Feasibility, that's putting something forth that is very practical. And you're showing that there's a way that you actually could implement it. You've thought about some different kinds of constraints. Maybe you don't have enough time. Maybe there's resource constraints. And so you've actually at least embedded that within whatever you're communicating. And I think of feasibility as when you're expressing voice, that you've captured a little bit of the how. So the rationale has given us that foundation. This is why we need to do something. Here's some evidence to support why this is really needed. This is something that I've gathered, whereas the feasibility is really emphasizing this is how we can do it. And I've at least thought about things that would prevent us from being able to actually execute this idea. On top of that, we saw high quality ideas were very much aligned to the organization. They had this organizational focus. And there's kind of two elements to this. One is that it aligns to what the organization's either vision is or their mission or their goals, and it's ultimately vital to the success. In that sense, it's also not something that's just about the individual who's speaking up. It's something that's really going to help the greater good of the company, as opposed to just the person who's speaking up. And that last dimension is novelty. And novelty is so important because it's what actually captures a lot of people's original intention in the first place. It's having something that's a little bit innovative, a little bit different than what people typically hear or what the organization typically does. And in fact, there's some research showing that novelty and feasibility are so important to go hand in hand. This is coming from the innovation, a lot of research on innovation, where we know novelty helps attract attention, but feasibility helps to ensure that it's something that we can actually do. So it's not just a pie in the sky kind of idea. Now, the benefits of these high quality voice, we thought there's probably a lot of them. We thought, for one, people who express higher quality voice are going to be looked at as more dedicated, committed, and actually especially so competent. We think people actually demonstrate their competence in part when you express these higher quality voice, that you've got a rationale when you're sharing these ideas, that you know how to think through the implementation aspects, that's more noticeable, it's more memorable for people also. It's going to stand out a lot more, that novelty component. And ultimately, it's also easier for managers to actually act on. You've already thought through it. You've given me the reason why. You've made it really feasible. I can easily pass this up the chain. And so you're reducing all those barriers, ultimately more likely to improve conditions. And so for that reason, we thought people who express higher quality voice are going to be looked upon much more favorably and also help their organization ultimately. And that's exactly what we found, actually. In some research we conducted, we saw that both peers and managers rated employees who expressed higher quality voice as more promotable and as better all-around performers. And we found that this effect held regardless how often the employee spoke up, regardless of how much their manager or peer liked them, or how much they thought they were competent to begin with. So it's a really, really robust effect that this high quality voice really can have a big impact on how people evaluate us. And we also found a really, really neat caveat when it comes to high quality and high frequency voice. What we saw was that employees who frequently expressed low quality voice, right? And that's where that arrow is at the bottom there. People who are often speaking up a lot, but with really low quality ideas, actually it backfired for them. They received the worst peer evaluations on promotion potential and performance. And as you can see on the right side, there really was no difference when people were speaking up a lot or a little, as long as it was high quality. And this really emphasized the point of, for employees, the importance of expressing high quality voice if you want to get noticed, if you want to help it improve your career, if you want it to be more likely to actually be endorsed and implemented. In some other research that Dr. Raven and I have conducted, we have seen that people who offer higher quality voice, they're more likely to get endorsed by the company and by their peers, and more likely to get implemented in organizations also. So taking that all together, how can we voice more effectively? It is fitting within these dimensions. So if it's about rationale, first do your homework, right? Gather some evidence, build a case. That homework could be looking for other examples of issues, maybe trying to see, do other people have similar issues, or would this potentially help other people? Is there a way that you could maybe run an A/B test or some sort of experimental test or some sort of test to see if this would actually work? Can you build a really coherent case? Because if you do, it's much harder to reject. Can you exude some thoughtfulness also in what you're doing? Just to show, one thing we heard a lot from leaders is that they get really frustrated when somebody comes to them with an idea, but they haven't thought through it all. When you build this compelling case, you have a lot of ammo to shut down any sort of concerns about it. And this thoughtfulness can really be kind of a holistic perspective of why this is a really good idea. Again, it makes it much harder to reject. And even if somebody can't do that, right, if they can't implement it for various reasons, you're still getting credit for at least putting forth that really strong idea. When it comes to feasibility, sometimes you can't think through all the actions of an idea, but at least to try to account for some of these constraints, account for time constraints, account for resource constraints. Can you even develop a plan? Again, that would be taking it quite a bit further. That's not always possible, but the extent that you can at least show when you've thought about some impediments, why this might not be possible, but how you could work around it. Again, that shows that you've put a lot of thought into it, and that helps whoever's listening to you figure out how I could actually act on it. Again, more likely that it'll help, more likely it'll be enacted, more likely that you would also get the credit for it. For organizational focus, it's so important. And the other thing that we hear the most from leaders is they got really frustrated when somebody would bring an idea or an issue to them that really only affected them. Even if it seemed like something that was kind of pro-social, it often came across as very selfish and self-centered. So the extent that you can build a compelling case that this benefits more than just yourself, that would also be higher quality, more likely that they would listen to you and actually follow through. And also to try to create some alignment to whatever it is that your organization is trying to accomplish, the vision, the goals, the mission of the organization. So if you know, for example, that your company's values are around being client-focused and client-first, to couch your ideas from that perspective would lend it a lot more credence, showing that you know what's best for the organization is what you're proposing. And that last one with novelty is to try to highlight why your idea is very unique. Maybe you could consider what other people have done before in your organization or elsewhere, and do some sort of contrast in that sense to highlight what makes your voice very unique. Right? And by putting all these together, we can really put forth these higher quality voice. If I could go back to myself in that General Mills situation, I think I had some level of rationale, a little bit maybe when it came to novelty, but the feasibility it really wasn't there. I was lucky that I was able to be partnered with somebody. But if I could go back, I would have said, well, what could I have done to maybe thought a little bit more about how we would actually make this change? I don't think I created much alignment on why it would be beneficial for the organization. I knew it was a problem for me and my colleagues, but that was not how I was framing it as much. And so there's a lot of lessons that we could take away. Maybe not every voice is going to have high rationale, feasibility, organizational focus, or novelty, but the extent that you can embed that in any kind of suggestion you're offering, again, much more likely to be well received. So now I'm going to switch gears to what it is leaders can do then to encourage voice. Unfortunately, lots of research within this domain kind of points to two ideas about being open and responsive. And I'm going to reflect back on what I shared before about that feelings of futility and fear, because this layers onto it. When you demonstrate that you're open, you're essentially debunking the idea that that voice is very risky, right? That you're debunking the idea of that I should be afraid about speaking up. And when you exude this responsiveness, when you respond to people's voice, you help to debunk the idea that there's no point. And so that's really important in both debunking the fear and futility perspective of being open and responsive. So I'm going to give you 5 behaviors that I think would really, really help demonstrate this encouragement for voice. First 2 are around openness. It seems so obvious, but it's so critical and so often overmissed to clarify that you're approachable. And this is not something that you can just do once. I think that's something we often think as a leader. Well, I say my door is open. People should know that. No, definitely not, and not necessarily. It's something you have to continually reiterate to your teams, continually reiterate to your people that you are very much approachable, and stating that you've got that open door. It's setting the foundation. Again, it might seem obvious, but if you don't communicate that, I would never assume that. And oftentimes people aren't sure that's even the case. So that's really setting the foundation. Following up on that is to actively invite input, actively solicit opinions. Go to your people, say, I want to hear from you. What ideas do you have? What concerns do you have? What information do you have that would help us make a better decision? Doing that in a meeting, after a meeting, via email, any which way that, and as many as possible, really, to actually show, I'm not just saying I'm approachable, I want to hear from you. So it's a behavior that's really supporting that, taking it a step further. The third one that kind of straddles between openness and responsiveness, and arguably maybe the most important on the list, is to offer appreciation when people are speaking up. This is basically a form of positive reinforcement. It's so important because what you're doing in that sense is you're not just telling the person who shared an idea, thank you, and they feel recognized, and they're more likely to speak up again. You're basically telling everybody else, these are the behaviors when you speak up, especially with high quality ideas, I appreciate it. These are the behaviors I want to see everybody do. And that's how you display that, by offering that genuine appreciation to people who push past those fears. We said it's courageous to speak up. People are implicitly afraid. For somebody to push past that, maybe you don't agree with what they said, but to at least offer appreciation and recognition that they spoke up, that shows them that you're not just saying that you're approachable, you really are. You've got behaviors now backing up your statement that I am approachable. And so a really, really impactful behavior that we just don't see enough. Moving towards a little bit more on the responsiveness, it's a really hard thing for leaders to do, to actively listen and ask questions. So not just listen, waiting for your chance to respond, but to make sure you're really listening to what your people are trying to explain to you. So guarding your emotions, guarding your assumptions, asking questions to show that you really want to hear from them, but also so that you fully understand the problem that they're expressing, so that you can actually do something about it. One of the quotes that I also really love from our leaders, they said, if you're going to ask an employee to be vulnerable, and again, they are being very vulnerable. We've shown that everyone assumes that it's a little risky. And to share that idea, then you really need to listen. If you're not going to do it in a genuine, wholehearted way, don't do it at all. And I definitely would agree with that. Closing the loop there is to take action or explain why not. One thing you don't see in this list is implement every idea that you hear. Now, that's not the way to encourage voice per se. I'm sure that's a form of encouragement, wouldn't hurt. That's not what we're advocating for here. What frustrates employees the most when they speak up is that deaf ear, that they feel like nothing's actually going to happen, so they're not going to do it again. So it's so important, even if you have to reject their idea, even if you say, sorry, we just don't have the resources now, we just can't do it now, or let me think about it and get back to you, get back to them. Right? It's so important. There's amazing research when it came to organizational justice in the 90s that shows us that people are perfectly capable of accepting decisions that they don't like, that they don't even think is fair, provided that you've got what's called informational interpersonal justice. This provided that leaders explain why you're not doing something or why you are, and that you do so with some sensitivity towards them, that they put themselves out there, right? They're risking themselves a little bit, that you have a little bit of care in terms of why you're not able to do that. It's so important. So we're not saying accept everything, but at least offer that explanation is critical to make sure that you've got this really, really supportive climate that more and more people will speak up and get those ideas that you really do need as a manager. Yet it's so critical to have both the openness and responsiveness. If you are very open, you say, yep, my door's open, come anytime, who's got ideas? And then people speak up and you don't do anything, that's hypocritical. And what does everyone learn? Well, they say they're open, clearly not. I'm not going to speak up anymore. And just the same on the flip side, it's not enough to just be responsive when people speak up. You have to clarify. I want to hear from you. What do you have? That was a great idea. Thanks for sharing that with me. And if you don't do that, it's pointless, really, because no one's going to come to you in the first place. You can be as responsive as possible, but nobody's coming. It's this duality that, again, fights the fear, that fights the futility, that encourages people to speak up. And so with that, I think this quote really summarizes what we're trying to accomplish here and why it's so important, not just for the organization's performance, but for that individual who's speaking up, that if someone can present an idea that gains traction and results in change, now that's a powerful person. They feel connected to the organization, they feel engaged, they feel valued, they feel that they're a legitimate part of something. And I think those are pretty fundamental human needs. So that I'm going to turn over back to Jenna to explain a little bit more about the organizational systems.
All right, thank you so much, Kyle. I just want to take a moment and say I'm very proud of Kyle. He's a Smith alumnus, have recently graduated with his PhD a couple of years ago, and has been really the key driver of this research that we've talked about. It was his passion during the PhD to really focus on voice. and has done a great job at being able to actually educate people about the importance of this phenomena and really contribute. So thank you and good job, Kyle. Where I'm going to go right now is a little bit more macro. And that's to say that we've talked about, and Kyle walked us through kind of what you can do individually as a person who wants to voice, and then what you as a leader can do to encourage others to voice. But the question remains of what if this is an institutional problem? What if this is the organization overall just doesn't seem to have an acceptance or an openness to employees voicing? This is not all that uncommon. And so many organizations have started talking about the difficulties of actually encouraging this kind of passive sort of culture. And we see this, one very, very public example of this in the past several years has been the Phoenix pay system debacle in Canada. So the Phoenix pay system implemented by the government has already cost the government and the taxpayers $1.5 billion, and was described by Auditor General Michael Ferguson as being an incomprehensible failure. It was basically described by him as being the part of this obedient public service culture. And if you dive into employees with the interviews with the employees who work there, they basically said that they were being told that they were not team players if they dared to critique the situation, that the environment was one that did not reward the sharing of negative news. And so this is what we see as kind of a voice suppression. And I want to read to you a quote from one of the people who actually worked there. This was someone who worked for the government for 40 years in government payroll. And she said, "The management brought this in and we were supposed to buy into it. Nobody listened to anything. A lot of us were middle-aged women. So who's going to listen to us?" And then she went on and concluded, "Well, I really think that they should start listening to the people who are interested, who are actually invested in doing the work." There's a big disconnect between people who do the work and people who make the decisions. So when we see this suppression of voice throughout organizations, it's essentially created a culture of silence, and we need to fight this. Now, in the auditor's report, he came back and said, "I don't have a set of instructions to fix a broken government culture. The culture problem is real and it urgently needs to be fixed." And I've been hearing this from a lot of organizations over the last decade or more, that this is a fundamental problem that we've been working towards providing a set of instructions for organizations and organizational leaders in order to build a better work environment or culture where voice is actually welcomed and encouraged. And so if we want to build that, I'd say there's three major elements that it would point to. The first is psychological safety. Now, Kyle's actually already described this in many ways. It's about that openness and responsiveness. This idea actually came out of, for those of you who are familiar with Amy Edmondson at Harvard Business School, she's done a tremendous amount of work and is the leader in this area. And some of her early work on psychological safety found this paradoxical finding where she would go in and study healthcare teams and these nursing units in which they had higher quality leadership. They actually had people saying that it was a safe interpersonal environment. They felt safe to speak up. They actually had higher levels of medication errors than those where people said, "Oh no, the leadership here is not supportive. They don't listen to us." And at first it's like, okay, wait a second. Why is this positive interpersonal leadership environment actually associated with more errors? What they realized is that it was simply just the underreporting. So all of these errors and all of the problems are just being silenced. They're being swept under the rug. And so you end up with ultimately more problems in the long run. And so in the short run, you actually, when you start to encourage, what she concluded is in the short run, you actually, as you improve leadership, you might hear more errors. But then by learning about them, this actually encouraged us to learn how to prevent them and to put in place systems and structures that encourage better practices, and actually, those higher quality ideas, when we listen to them, ultimately result in higher quality practices that continuously improve the organization in the long run. But none of that happens without that psychological safety in the first place. Just one more example on psychological safety. I think this one, when Alan Mulally back in the mid 2000s took over Ford Motor Company, it was on track to lose billions of dollars that year. It was a financial disaster. And he tells a story about when he first started asking people what's wrong. He would show up at the executive meetings and there'd be 300 executives 300 reports were given to him each week that they would come together saying, oh, nothing's wrong. And so they were color coded, green, yellow, red. And there was a history at Ford where those people who would point out problems were essentially, they were fired. They would not survive the admitting of mistakes. And so not only was there a unwillingness to report errors, there was actually a suppression of anything that could possibly be wrong. And that was part of the reason it was losing billions of dollars, because all those mistakes were just swept under the rug. And so he tells a story about 1 week, and week after week after week, everyone just reported these green reports. And 1 week, one brave executive dared to come in and say, hey, something was yellow, it was not going well. And everybody else looked on in horror, thinking that he was going to get fired. And instead, Alan Mulally stood up and clapped and said, thank you so much for reporting that there's a problem. And not only did he congratulate and made a big deal about it, he also then seated that executive closer to him at the next meeting to recognize and encourage how valuable it is to feel safe and that he was going to be welcome and encouraging to that. So that's what we need to be seeing from the senior executive team, is this openness to a psychological safety environment where people are actually encouraged and rewarded, and that openness and responsiveness that Kyle talked about. The second thing on this slide is the shifting leaders' strategic lens from an execution as efficiency to an execution as learning type of angle. What we mean by that, the old way of running an organization was to say, well, leaders know everything, and so they provide the answers. Employees, their job is to follow the directions. Someone at some point lays out those optimal work processes. They're set up in advance. They're not continuously changed or developed. Leaders typically come along, give you feedback. It's one way, it's corrective. They get you back on track to follow those instructions. And so therefore, employees aren't really encouraged or engage and encouraged to engage in a lot of problem solving on a regular basis. Now, execution as efficiency is dead. It should be dead. And yet we still see it being used in so many organizations. This is that obedient public service culture that we hear about in the Phoenix pay system. So it should have a nice little, RIP, tombstone on top of it here, because all of us in our organizations now should be taking more of an execution as learning approach, where the leaders, your job is to not have all the answers. It's actually to set the direction, to give people a vision or a meeting or a direction that's going to inspire the employees, and they know what needs to be done. So therefore, they actually go out and discover the answers. And it's not as if you have all the answers in advance or all the work processes are designed in advance, but it's just a tentative starting point. And then as you tackle all the problems, then things get better and better. So there's this continuous improvement over time. Because employees have valuable information as the key members of the organization that are on the front lines, you have to listen to the feedback. It must be two-way communications, bidirectional. And because of that, employees are the source of most of your valuable problem solving. Now, this mindset is that which we're teaching in pretty much all leadership courses we teach in our exec ed courses, and this idea of being an engaging leader that's actually facilitating the leveraging of all talent in organizations. And yet the old ways of doing things, the way that has been done for decades, are often still relics in the organizations out there where we don't have this openness. Once you get this mindset in place, and the senior team has this mindset in place, you've actually got the foundations for building that learning organization. Now, I want to point out, and this again is Amy Edmondson's work, there's plenty written out there about this if anyone wants to read more about the learning organization, but it has three elements. So we've got the supporting learning environment, the concrete learning processes and practices, as well as that leadership that reinforces learning. What I want to do is circle on this slide several of these elements of a learning organization that are all about voice. They're all about encouraging employees to speak up and then listening when they do. So we already just talked about psychological safety, that leaders have to be open to differences. They have to appreciate the differences and openness to those new ideas. There need to be some practices in place, either formal or informal, to actually encourage the collection of information so that employees can engage in problem solving and then provide that information to the employer. So that's just the collection of the information from the employees, as well as the transfer back, that two-way dialogue. And then as Kyle laid out, the leadership that reinforces learning is essentially the openness and responsiveness. So including the debate, the dialogue, you don't have to agree to everything, but you should be listening to everything and encouraging deeper analysis and critical thinking and debate and dialogue about the direction forward and how to solve these problems. Now, this is the ideal of what organizations should be set up to do. Now, some people ask then, this is great, but it's cultural and it is hard to change the culture. We do need to change leaders' mindsets and the ways in which they're leading in order to do this throughout an entire organization, as the case of Alan Mulally at Ford Motor Company. But there are some practices that will actually benefit the organization to put in place that are more systems that can institutionalize this. One thought that comes to mind when we talk about soliciting ideas, a lot of people think back to that suggestion box. So I don't know if how many of you remember the Dilbert cartoons and all the cartoons from the 1980s and 90s when suggestion boxes were a big deal. But the idea was, well, okay, essentially everyone puts their ideas in there. There's a box that essentially is more or less a trash can. And so suggestion boxes fell out of favor, not surprisingly, because a lot of people will say, well, these suggestions, like this quote, ideas are useless unless they're actually used. The proof of their value is in their implementation, and until then, they're in limbo. So the idea behind the suggestion boxes was a good idea, in that we want to listen to employees and we want to have a way of collecting information and being able to respond back to it. The dead end, or the trash can of how we collected the ideas, was the bad idea. There's been a huge trend in the last 5 years or so that has really disrupted the way that employees are listened to in an organizational way. So a lot of corporations now are using digital voice platforms. There's numerous ones of these available. There's several dozen of them I'm aware of. I just gave you a few examples here, like Vocally, Better, Innovation, Bringing Neat, and Suggestion Ox. And Kyle and I have actually done another research project with a company that has been able to implement these systems in large Fortune 500 types of companies, and looked at the quality of voice messages that were coming through on those platforms as well. But what we've learned is that organizations that are working with these types of platforms are sending out the message of openness. They're actually encouraging that psychological safety, that openness to, hey, we want to listen to you. And what's cool about these is that it's not like the trash can anymore. It's actually a collaborative platform. So it uses a social networking approach and crowdsourcing. So employees put ideas up there, and then much like Facebook style likes and dislikes and commenting, then you can get a community of people around an idea. And let me just give you an example here. This is a collaboration board from Vocally, and what you can see, I know the text is small here. But for example, the company can put forth challenges. Individuals can say, okay, they can put forth polls or questions. So what kind of soda should we stock in the fridge? Challenge. The factory costs are increasing dramatically. What do we do about that? How can we make the ideas hub better? We need more ideas for volunteerism in organizations. People can put forth any number of suggestions, and then as individuals start to vote on it and comment on it, they actually turn into projects. And most of these platforms are set up then to have a direct line between the ideas and then the managerial accountability for actually responding to those ideas. So in the research project that we did, for example, we knew that these ideas, as they emerged, they were assigned to managers who are responsible for the particular ideas, and they needed to go and actually respond, whether or not it was implemented, not implemented, and then the rationale as to why they were not implemented, and then, or if it's in progress or in evaluation or development. And all of these platforms can then be used in this continuous improvement focus. So it gets us one step closer to that ideal of being able to have that organizational learning environment where employees are actually listened to. We're not, wasting tons of money every year on turnover because people feel ignored. You're actually having that two-way dialogue, and yet we actually are able to use those ideas from frontline employees to improve all the business processes. Now, they're not It's not going to magically fix all of your problems, simply just implementing one of these. You want to try to make sure that your program, if you do actually put in place a digital voice program, is aligned with the organizational culture, and that the leaders are encouraging these types of behaviors first and foremost, and we have that psychological safety. As we described earlier, the ideas are better if they're higher quality, and so actually encourage employees to provide a strong rationale, or to think about feasibility, or to think about the organizational focus or the novelty, to actually potentially lay this out in the system as parts or elements of what they're proposing. It's also important that employees know what happened. So I worked with one organization years ago where people said, well, we're actually implementing one of these systems, and yet the ideas would not get responded to for months. So not surprisingly, then employees stopped giving ideas because they might not get a response for 6 months as to what was going to happen. And they ultimately concluded that management was ignoring their ideas. And when that happens, people stop speaking up. Recognition is so crucial. So one other organizations I worked with on this gave reward. So it was either some sort of recognition or reward, or if there was a cost savings associated with an idea that was implemented, they got a portion of the cost savings. So it's some way of actually recognizing that there's value in either financial or social or interpersonal esteem value, and actually putting forward ideas. And then of course, any program like this that you implement, improvement of it should be the focus of improvement as well. All right, so with that said, I think that's going to wrap up our the format of our conversation with just one final quote. And this is what I say. We started off talking about the challenges of voice, and how it takes some courage to be able to overcome your fears. There's a quote from Winston Churchill I love, which is that courage is what it takes to stand up and speak. Courage is also what it takes to sit down and listen. So I hope all of you will have the courage to stand up and speak and use your voice when necessary. But then as leaders, to also have the courage to sit down and listen, and to work collaboratively through the ideas that emerge as a way of engaging your workforce more effectively. Thank you very much. And I think I'm going to turn it back over to Meredith.
Hi. Thanks, you two. That was fantastic. We've had a lot of questions in, and a lot of them, they're interesting. They're all sort of similar, but also different. Many having to do sort of like the perspective of the employee or the manager. Let's start with this question from Sean Cable. What is the biggest mistake leaders make in trying to encourage voice?
All right, I'll field that one. And thanks for the questions. Yeah, I saw a lot of them coming. I wanted to respond to. I'll go back to the idea of openness and responsiveness. What I see the most, at least, and in talking with leaders too, I think we're pretty good at doing that openness. It's the responsiveness that leaders really fail to follow through on, and it's challenging. Of course, you might hear a lot of ideas, and we know that managers are often overburdened with just too many ideas to action. That's why, again, we really try to stay realistic too and say, okay, you can't do everything. I see the biggest mistake though is doing nothing because you can't do anything. It's almost a paralysis of having too many things to do. Again, people don't expect you to have to implement everything. Maybe you can't do it right now. That would probably be one of the biggest ones. And then I think a different one that maybe we don't think about as much, which we weren't discussing, is sometimes there's an expectation that, okay, now it was given to me, and now as a manager, it's my job to solve it, where that's just not the case. And so to have that two-way discussion that Jana was just talking about, I think is a big opportunity for managers. So just first off, I'd say the biggest one is be responsive to, like you need to close the loop, but also recognizing that this doesn't mean it falls on you entirely to do, and that you can have that discussion and together try to come up with a solution.
Right now, but from the perspective of the employee asking the questions, what this person's asking, what do you do with a boss who, you're trying to speak to them and they're constantly interrupting you or cutting you off? Another person asks, how do you overcome the anxiety of asking questions of senior leadership? Two good and challenging situations.
Yeah, absolutely. And so as you can see, what we try to do with the presentation is focus on both the employee's perspective and the leader's perspective. I think it's helpful to normalize the idea that this is risky, that basically everybody looks at it with a level of risk. It's a conversation I have with lots of people about, I'm a little bit nervous, or maybe I'm a little shy.
Right.
I'm a little nervous or maybe a little shy. So I'm not going to speak up in that sense. I mean, our goal with the research was to give people the idea of, if you can present it with this high quality idea, that would overcome some of the risk to say, well, we've got evidence to support what I'm saying. It's thoughtful, it's novel, and that would at least disarm kind of off the bat. But I think I might have missed your second question there, Meredith.
Well, somebody sort of along the same lines. So you've got the issue of like person feeling like they're being cut off by their boss, but then the other person who's feeling extreme anxiety about trying to bring the question up to the senior leadership. So they know they want to, perhaps they've done all their due diligence, but they still have in themselves this real anxiety about doing it.
Yeah, and for some people, it's just a very difficult thing to overcome. I don't think there's an anecdote to overcome the anxiety. And I mentioned the research we found, even just on a weekly basis, that's fluctuations in anxiety, right? Mental health, essentially. And we know if we are experiencing a little bit more anxiety in 1 week, we are less likely to speak up. And that's where I really turn more to the leaders. For employees, the best advice I have is to try to make it as high quality as possible, to give it a shot and to recognize your fears are valid. They're things that most people do feel. But I think you'll debunk them pretty quickly as soon as you speak up in an organization. And if not, maybe we'll go all the way back to Jenna's EDLN idea. Maybe it's time for a different opportunity, unfortunately.
Right. Actually, you guys may choose some questions. There are quite a lot of great questions here, and they're coming in fast and furious. I want to touch on this one. Have there been any observations on how high quality voice is received when it comes from a woman versus a man?
That's a great question. No, we haven't done any research on anything gender related when it comes to high quality voice. There actually surprisingly isn't too much research within gender in this area. And I think we're going to start seeing a little bit of a change in that sense. I mean, there's a little bit, we know, for example, where if you don't have enough of a gender representation in some groups, and some research by Crystal Farr at the University of Washington and some of her colleagues, they found that you're going to be less likely to actually be heard in the first place. There's some research that shows if you're speaking up about something that's maybe gender sensitive, and this was from some researchers at the University of Michigan, that if it's gender sensitive, that we know that you'd be more likely to speak up to somebody about that issue if they've already clarified that they have a little bit more openness to that in the first place. So nothing specific to quality, unfortunately, but I appreciate a future research idea when I hear a really good one. So thank you for that.
Right. Jana, do you want to jump into any of this? Or I see you sifting through these really great questions. They're coming in fast and furious.
Let me follow up on the gender thing. So we haven't looked at voice quality. There is a good amount of work in communication science that's actually looked at, male and female communication, and women, when they express an idea in a male-dominated environment, often have it not heard as much. And so this is actually really an important issue to tackle in the future. We haven't talked about quality, but I think I would say is that the voice quality is that we saw no gender differences in that regard. And so if anything, if generally speaking up might get ignored, but by virtue of actually adding in really high quality, strong reason, strong feasibility, strong rationale, it's harder to be ignored when you build the quality of an idea.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. We have just a short number of minutes left, and there are just a lot of questions here. So I don't know if there are any that you've particularly picked out that you guys want to answer. Yeah. Or I'm just going to
you whatever you've got, unless Jada has one. I wasn't monitoring them. Sorry.
Okay. There are some leaders who ask for suggestions and input, but still end up overlooking your input and go with their own ideas. How do you deal with leaders who may respond this way?
Yeah, and I guess I saw a series of questions along the theme of I've got a difficult manager and what can I do about it? And unfortunately, there's not too much anecdotes we have for that, in the sense of our anecdote that we're trying to come up with is the high quality. It does reduce that rejection. If a manager is going to jump in, I mean, that's why, as you could see, when we're focusing on what leaders can do, it is a reminder of, don't jump in, let people speak and express themselves. One thing that might be helpful though in that case, the one thing, and actually there's some really neat research coming out right now on it, is to build a coalition a little bit could really help in that case where you find that you're just not breaking through. There is research showing that sometimes it's just a personal thing too. When you build a coalition though, you're helping to gain some endorsement, and it's basically what we call social proof. It's like, well, I'm not the only one who feels this way. These are the other colleagues of mine who also feel this way. And so that can be a really helpful strategy to break down the barrier of where you feel like your manager's not listening to you.
Great. Okay. That's helpful. Along the lines of the gender question, we've got a few questions here coming in around visible minorities, non-native English speakers, people who maybe don't feel necessarily empowered. What about them? What about those people and their access to voice? Any thoughts?
I'll take that one. I think in terms of the feeling of empowerment, some of this goes back to that implicit voice idea. Like people fear it as being risky. They might feel disempowered. They might feel like there's more risk if they speak up, if they're not part of the dominant majority. One of the things that you can do is actually to challenge that belief, and it's hard. You have to dig deep inside yourself to challenge it. I teach, courses on global virtual teams and work with a lot of multicultural populations, and we talk about, the importance of kind of getting outside your comfort zone and actually challenging that. And then also, it's kind of two-way. When we talk about active listening, so there's actually two-way. There's checking. So, speak up, and then also ask for feedback about whether or not your ideas were actually well understood. And then when other people express their ideas, you do the active listening back to mirror back what you heard. And that two-way dialogue of tailoring communications, but then also, fighting the fear and doing it anyway is a good way to tackle it, because almost all of the leaders we spoke to said that they wished they had more voice and that they wanted employees to speak up more and wondered why they weren't. So my guess is that people will actually be very welcome to it. You just have to be willing to actually take that risk.
Okay, helpful, thank you. From the point of view of the manager now, someone asks, can you provide suggestions on how a leader can react to a low quality voice from an employee and encourage them to rethink or reapproach an idea without coming across as negative?
Yeah, that's a wonderful
opportunity.
Yeah,
go ahead.
No, that's a wonderful question. That actually is very much what we're thinking about when we dove with our research. It's education, it's training, and that's what managers are there for, developing your people. And that's when we present these 4 facets of high quality. We couch it today from, okay, this is for you as employees, but the reality is it's you for leaders too. We wanted to give you something to go to your employees and say, this is why we're maybe not following through on what you're doing. Next time you want to offer an idea, what I would like to see is, and that's where we say, try to doing some coaching along those dimensions of high quality. So next time, please do a little bit more homework, have a little bit of thoughtfulness, maybe give an example. Can you think about how this might be? And so you kind of work together with them. Hopefully, once you start setting that foundation, that's something that it's going to be learned, and they're going to know next time how to do that. So have you thought about how this impacts your organization? I mean, a lot of it, people aren't trying to come up with something selfish or self-centered. They see an idea, they want to fix it. Maybe they don't realize that, okay, well, this is really just helping you, and this doesn't help anybody else. So what can we do? It's that training aspect.
Okay, Jana, you want to add?
I also I want to go back to the idea of recognition. I was seeing another question there as well.
Around recognition coming in now.
Like
someone feels someone else's idea.
So it's almost like, so there's the one ability to kind of coach people who don't do it right, but the other way, people learn through social modeling, right? So behavior modeling. So if you recognize those people who are giving exactly what you're looking for, and praise the feasibility or the implementation, the reality of implementation of how it might be, or actually praise people about how well aligned this is in terms of how the organization is going. The praise communicates a lot. And has the double duty because it's not a corrective lens, right? So no one has to feel bad about it. It's a praise for those who did, and get recognized, who put the ideas forward, and an education for those who want to do that as well.
Right. Okay. I do need to wrap things up. Here's a question I don't know if you can answer, but how do you know when voice is simply insufficient? And in fact, is you just need to get out of there. You just need, as they say, to exit.
Yeah, this is, this gets into the challenging part. We might do another session someday on voicing in very difficult circumstances. We talked about pulling it in today, but when you have voiced and you have, done your complaining to the appropriate authorities, might be something illegal, something difficult, something that you've really done what you can and are being actively suppressed, you're being actively silenced, and you can't look at yourself in the mirror every day because you just can't live with it anymore. It's time to go.
Right. Okay, that's great. That's very straightforward advice. Thank you. We have so many more questions that we can't get to. A couple of people have asked about getting copies of the slides. As I said in the introduction, in fact, what you'll all be getting is a recording of the presentation. So you'll be able to watch and rewatch and share this presentation with your colleagues. Jen and Kyle, just give me a moment. I need to do our little plug for what's coming up next. So firstly, I always let people know at the end of our presentations that there are lots of opportunities for online learning at Smith School of Business through Queen's Executive Education. And coming up later this summer, we have a couple of two-day sessions, one on developing your leadership presence. And then in September, we've got our very popular Queen's Leadership Program. So visit smithqueens.com/execed for more information on those programs. I also want to let you know that we have another webinar coming up fairly soon. Thursday, July 8th, we're going to be getting everyone into the Olympic spirit with a special conversation with Tom Hall, who is the Director of Communications and Media Relations at the Canadian Olympic Committee, who also happens to be a medal-winning Olympian. He was a canoeist. This is going to be a behind-the-scenes look at the challenges and opportunities in promoting and running the Olympic Games, especially in this unusual pandemic year. So I hope you'll be able to join us. More information about that will be coming in your inbox soon. So Kyle and Jana, thank you very much for your time today. I wish we had more time as always, but we've learned lots. People have been very thankful and appreciative. So, so thanks to both of you. To our audience, thank you for tuning in, and I wish you all a good day and to see you again online soon. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Meredith.